I'm Jude Kelly. I'm the Artistic Director of the Ripples of Hope Festival. And some of you have been with us all day to explore different aspects of human rights. And some of you have just come tonight to hear the wonderful Elif Shafak give the H.G. Wells Penn Lecture. And whichever of those two things it is, you'll be really glad to be here for this, because I've already read it. And it's just such a provocative and wonderful piece of work that you're going to be listening to. I'd like to thank Sam and then Tracy, who are going to be signing tonight. And there is no end to the versatility of the signers. They have to be able to do all kinds of words like grapefruit, spontaneously, not to mention some of the words that have come up when we discuss things like sexual consent. All of it means that, along with a kind of ability for us to talk together with words, we can bring together through signing a kind of physical manifestation of the fact that unless people have access to everything that is available to all of us, then we are diminishing the possibility of people's rights. So thank you to the signers for the amazing work that they're going to do all night. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dan Gorman, because this tonight is the Ripples of Hope and English Penn lecture. Ripples of Hope obviously is there, built around the Robert F. Kennedy work of human rights, to say that every single one of us can be a ripple of hope with one action and one decision that we take to further justice for ourselves and others. And English Penn is one of the oldest human rights organisations. It's championing the freedom to write and the freedom to read around the world. And Dan, who's the director of English Penn, prior to this, he was the executive director of Shuvak, which was Europe's largest festival of contemporary Arab culture. I'm going to let him tell you more about the work of Penn, so please welcome him to the stage. Dan Gorman.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be here. And it's been such a brilliant day today at the Ripples of Hope Festival. So welcome to you all to the Penn H.G. Wells Lecture. As you heard, my name is Dan Gorman, and I'm the director of English Penn, and I'm so honoured to be introducing today's event with the brilliant Elif Shafak. English Penn, just very briefly, because I know we want to get onto the main event, but English Penn is one of the world's oldest human rights organisations. We were founded in 1921, championing the freedom to write and the freedom to read around the world. So this year is our centenary. It's a very special year for us. We've had events happening all through the year. They have all been online. We have had some workshops in person, but this is our first public event as part of the centenary, and today has been the first day of public events for us. So it's very, very special for us to be here, and it couldn't be a better day. We're so thankful to Ripples of Hope for all of the support and engagement that they have given us, and to the entire team, to Jude Kelly, to Maria Bota, and the entire Ripples of Hope team. Thank you. The project within the centenary is called Common Currency, and it's an 18-month celebration of freedom of expression, creative campaigning, and the best literature the world has to offer. So this feels like a very fitting event for that. English Penn is a membership organisation, and with the support of our members, which is a community of writers, readers, and activists, we protect freedom of expression whenever it is under attack. Membership is open to all. You're all very welcome to join, so please do have a look on our website. So why a Penn H.G. Wells lecture? H.G. Wells was very deeply involved in the work of Penn in the early days. He was a personal friend of the founder of Penn, Catherine Amy Dawson Scott, and attended the first meeting in 1921. He then went on to become the second president of English Penn from 1932 to 1936. His main and central contribution to the organization was in shaping the commitment to free expression, which happened concurrently with the rise of fascism across Europe throughout the 1930s. After that, he continued to agitate for the right to free expression, something that formed part of his 1939 Declaration of Rights. His free speech commitments within this not only informed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but obviously also continue to be central to human rights in the world today. And with that background, I'm really delighted to now introduce Elif Shafak. Elif Shafak is an award-winning British-Turkish novelist and the most widely read female author in Turkey, and surely also very close to that in the UK. She writes both in Turkish and English and has published 19 books, 12 of which are novels. Her work has been translated into 55 languages, and for an organization that works to promote bibliodiversity, that's surely something to be applauded. And when you read Elif's work, it should come as no surprise to hear that she holds a PhD in political science. In 2017, she was chosen by Politico as one of the 12 people who would make the world better. Her book, 10 minutes, 38 seconds in the strange world, was shortlisted for a Booker Prize in 2019 and was Blackwell's Book of the Year. The 40 Rules of Love was chosen by the BBC among the 100 novels that shaped our world. Her most recent work, The Island of Missing Trees, was described as an outstanding work of breathtaking beauty by Lem Sissay and brilliant by Robin McFarlane. I've had the chance to read it, and they are right, so I really encourage you to pick up a copy. There are copies available on the bookstall outside, some of which are signed if you get there quickly, after the event, of course. We are really delighted to count Elif as a long-term supporter and friend of English Pen and the Pen movement more broadly. So please join me in welcoming her to the stage to deliver the 2021 Penn H.G. Wells Lecture. Thank you. Thank you, Elif. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. It's so exciting to be in Manchester and to join the Ripples of Hope Festival, to join the English Pen, both of which I deeply respect, and also to join people who care about human rights, who care about the future of our democracies. And I'm very honored to present the H.G. Wells Lecture this year. I also want to tell you that I'm very much looking forward to your questions. If you don't agree with anything I say, please feel free to share it with us at the end of the conversation, so that we can turn this into a dialogue together. So the first time I got my hands on a book written by H.G. Wells, I was a student in Turkey. I found an old edition in an arcade of little second-hand shops that I visited often to buy novels and fanzines and to check the latest heavy metal albums. Its cover stained by damp, its pages slightly tattered, the book showed signs of previous ownership. The First Humans in the Moon, the title read. Later, I would discover that the Turkish translation was gender neutral, but that the original, The First Man in the Moon, wasn't. At the time, I was not much interested in science fiction. I had purchased the book because it had intrigued me for a reason I could not quite comprehend. But reading it was not a priority. Back then, I was enamored with Russian literature, Gogol's Dead Souls, Dostoevsky's Notes from a Dead House, and the brothers Karamazov had permanently shifted something within me. I quarreled with Tolstoy in my mind. I cried for Anna Akhmatova and was secretly in love with Alexandra Kollontai. It was a time in my life when I was extremely restless, impatient, and had so much anger inside that it hurt. I wanted to read the kind of literature that dealt with what I saw as the harsh socio-political realities. A fantasy story which took place in a different corner of the solar system was therefore not a pressing matter. Hence, in my careless rush and ignorance, I underestimated and I ignored H.G. Wells, and his novel remained on my shelf, unread and unloved for a long, long while. When I moved from Ankara to Istanbul in my early 20s, quietly dreaming of becoming an author, I had no particular reason to bring Wells with me, but I did. I rented a small flat near the Taksim Square on a street called Kazancı Yokuşu, the steep street of cauldron makers. It was a flat with a view, the estate agent assured me. If you placed a stool under one corner of the only window in the sitting room, which was also my study and bedroom, and if you stepped on it and craned your head far enough to the right, and provided the sky was clear and there wasn't any mist rising from the horizon, you could catch sight of a sliver of shimmering blue, a slash of the beauty of the Bosphorus, and even allow yourself to be drawn in, if not by the sea itself, by the faintest promise of it. It was in this flat, during those early days in Istanbul, that I started reading The First Man in the Moon. Somehow, H.G. Wells' lunar city, with its dazzling caverns and erratic weather, connected in my imagination with the old megapolis that I found myself in, with its serpentine streets and no less erratic characters. The Selenites, the socially complex and technologically sophisticated underground natives of the moon, an easy bunch to understand. But then again, as I would discover soon enough, nor were the Istanbulites. H.G. Wells, a writer trained as a scientist and prolific across many genres, was uniquely positioned to invent stories that thrived on multidisciplinary knowledge and a broad vision. This distinguished him from most of his literary contemporaries. He not only understood our existential craving for innovation, experimentation, and endless novelty, but he also feared the dark side of technology. Throughout his life, he was cognizant of the fact that the drums of war, self-destruction, and jingoism always kept beating somewhere in the background of modernity, in harmony with the pulse of civilization. He said, and I quote, "Across the path of mankind, the storm of another great war may break, bringing with it, for a time, more brutal repressions and vaster injuries even than its predecessor." In his writings, Wells conveyed a plethora of futuristic prophecies, from space travel to genetic engineering, from the atomic bomb to the World Wide Web. There was no other fiction writer who saw into the future of humankind as clearly and boldly as he did. Were he to have been alive at the very end of the 20th century, what would he have made of that world? I'm especially curious to know what he would have thought about the unbridled optimism characteristic of the era, an optimism which was shared at the time by liberal politicians, political scientists, and Silicon Valley alike. The rosy conviction that Western democracy had triumphed once and for all, and that, thanks to the proliferation of digital technologies, the whole world would, sooner or later, become one big democratic global village. The naive expectation that if you could only spread information freely beyond borders, people would become informed citizens, and thus they would make the right choices at the right time. All of that was yesterday, and yesterday was an era of contagious optimism that verged dangerously on complacency. Because if history is by definition linear and progressive, if there's no viable alternative to liberal democracy, why should you worry about the future of human rights? Why should you worry about the future of rule of law, or freedom of speech, or media diversity? The Western world was regarded as safe, solid, stable. Democracy, once achieved, could not be disintegrated. How could anyone who had tasted the freedoms of democracy ever agree to discard it to the winds? As for non-Western countries, not yet democratic, but surely would be one day, it was only a matter of time before they would find the right path. Momentarily, they were liquid, not yet settled, rowdy, choppy waters, but they too would solidify sooner or later. And that was the expectation. Now, fast forward. Today, this dualistic way of seeing the world is shattered to pieces. Today, the ground beneath our feet does not feel solid anymore. We have entered the age of angst. An existential anxiety pervades everything. Ours is the age of pessimism. It is also the epoch of anger, a word with an interesting pedigree which has traveled into English via the Old Norse, ongr, which means sorrow, affliction, pain. So at the root of the word anger, there is hurt. Ours is a world that is hurting. If H.G. Wells were alive today, what would he think of this new century with its increasing polarization, warring, clashing epistemological tribes, rising populist authoritarianism, and bewildering pace of consumption, including consumption of misinformation, all of which are aggravated by digital technologies. In addition to a remarkable body of fiction, H.G. Wells wrote powerful social, political, and scientific commentary. According to him, world history was becoming more and more a race between education and catastrophe. He passionately believed that human history, in essence, is a history of ideas. He was a prominent public intellectual. Here in the UK, I find it interesting that this concept has a pejorative meaning, but this is not the case elsewhere. For instance, France has a long tradition of public intellectuals, and so does Russia. In South Africa, public intellectuals have played an important role in dismantling narratives legitimizing the continuation of the apartheid regime. In Turkey, the authorities tend to investigate, prosecute, or imprison public intellectuals, but at least we recognize that they exist. So perhaps it is time for Britons to rethink the term public intellectual, and instead of seeing it as an accolade of privilege, class, or private education, why don't we turn the term upside down and use it for those philosophers, writers, artists, poets, and activists of this privilege who contribute so much to civic space and civil society? Why can't we recognize and celebrate women public intellectuals, minority public intellectuals, LGBTQ+ public intellectuals, working class public intellectuals? It is in this vein that I believe H.G. Wells was one of our most important public minds. He was not afraid of turning the arrows of this criticism towards his own land, his own country, and at times towards himself. He could openly make fun of himself, explore his own follies and flaws, and he was vocally critical of Anglocentrism. History is full of examples that show us how the rise of nativism always goes hand in hand with the rise of binary oppositions. Us versus them. Are you one of us or are you one of them? Populist demagogues loudly claim that you can either be a nativist who prioritizes their country at the expense of building higher walls, locking all doors in order to keep other people's problems at bay, or you can instead go and be part of the global elite, of a global elite. Those are the only two options they tell us. But when we read H.G. Wells, he demonstrates deftly that it is possible to transcend this cliched dichotomy. We do not have to trap ourselves inside either the arrogance of ultranationalism or the injustices aggravated in the name of greedy globalism. Those are not the only two options we have. H.G. Wells was endlessly interested in internationalism. And this point is worth remembering today, when we need international solidarity and international sisterhood across borders, at a time when we need to remember our common humanity. The pandemic has demonstrated how deeply interconnected we all are. A virus originating in one part of the world can change the lives and livelihoods of people living miles and continents away. Climate crisis has made it all too clear that no part of the world will be immune to the impact of global warming. So whether it's environmental emergency, the possibility of another deadly pandemic, or cyber terrorism, we have massive global challenges ahead of us as humanity. And none of these challenges can be solved with the forces or the myths of exceptionalism, nativism, tribalism, or isolationism. I think it's utterly shameful that at a time when we so obviously need international cooperation, we have ended up with a kind of vaccine nationalism. All of this would have disappointed H.G. Wells, were he alive today. Democracy is not a medal that once earned can be framed and hung on a wall to hide the cracks. It's a delicate ecosystem, a living and breathing environment of interacting beings, checks and balances, diversity and inclusion, cooperation and coexistence. As such, it has to be nourished all the time. The ballot box in itself is not enough to sustain a proper pluralistic democracy. Let us not forget that many illiberal and even plainly authoritarian regimes today hold some sort of elections every few years. That's not a democracy. Majoritarianism is not the same thing as democracy. So in addition to the ballot box, one needs rule of law, separation of powers, free and diverse media, independent academia, women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights. When democratic norms and institutions are broken and the language of politics becomes increasingly aggressive and combative and full of martial metaphors, when opponents are regarded as enemies, we enter a murky territory. Monopolization of power is very dangerous. No politician, in my opinion, no political party, and certainly no tech company should have absolute power. History does not necessarily proceed in a steady linear progression. Time, actually, can move in all directions. It can even go backwards. It can also draw circles within circles, which means new generations can repeat the mistakes that their great-grandparents had already made. When countries slide backwards, the first rights that will be taken away will be women's rights and minority rights. And I think women and minorities have much more to lose when democracy is lost. H.G. Wells believed in a literature of ideas, art that engaged with the world and dared to ask questions, including difficult questions. He imagined a future where women are to be free as men. Daring to write about taboos, he supported not only gender equality, but also the sexual liberation of women so that they would in no way be enslaved or subordinated to the men they have chosen. I find it equally important that he advocated birth control at a time when it was not easy to do so. He did get all sorts of criticism for doing so, but he did not back down. H.G. Wells understood inequality. He knew how the widening and deepening of inequities would corrode human life and human happiness. He also understood desperation. In his iconic manifesto, written in 1940, The Rights of Man, he said, and I quote, "Unless we can struggle through the mounting perplexities of today to a new world order of law and safety, unless we can keep our heads and our courage so as to re-establish a candid life, our species is going to perish, mad, fighting and gibbering, a dwindling swarm of super Nazis on a devastated earth." There is no doubt that we're all struggling. Individually and collectively, we are struggling with too many negative emotions. And in the words of H.G. Wells, it becomes more and more difficult to keep a mental balance and not to give way to storms of exasperation. So I want to finish this lecture by inviting all of us to think more closely about that metaphor or that imagery, storms of exasperation that are surrounding us on all four sides. I think that's frightening. I think that is tiring. It is also debilitating. But whenever we feel the fatigue, let us also remember that if there's one thing that is much more debilitating and much more dangerous, it is actually the lack of all emotions, the lack of all feelings. In other words, when we become disconnected, when we become indifferent, desensitized, numb inside, when apathy descends and we stop connecting, when numbness descends and we stop caring, I think that is the real danger. At the end of the day, all fiction, in my opinion, tries to rehumanize people who have been dehumanized. And in that regard, as storytellers, of course we love language, of course we love words, we believe in the power of words, of course we love stories, but I think we're equally drawn to silences and people who have been silenced And maybe there's a part in us that wants to give more voice to those who have been silenced. So literature, in its essence, tries to punch holes and open windows in those walls of numbness that are surrounding us today. H.G. Wells was fearless in his progressive vision, but perhaps more importantly, I think he cared. He genuinely cared about the well-being and the future of his fellow human beings. And as we are facing today another humanitarian crisis, and as we will be facing more and more humanitarian crises tomorrow, perhaps that's the most important thing to remember. How do we keep these connections alive? How do we make sure that we continue to care? And how do we connect beyond all kinds of ethnic, religious, borders, boundaries that are drawn in front of us? I think that's going to be our biggest challenge in the days and the years ahead. How do we overcome this apathy? But if we can do that, I believe change is possible. Because we are being told that we're so small and everything else is so big. And sometimes we feel very small. Climate change is so big. I am an individual, what can I do? There are so many problems in the world. I'm so small, what can I do? So this feeling of helplessness, smallness, just pushes us into our own cocoons. If we can overcome this, if we can connect beyond borders, we will also see that we're not alone and we can make a difference together. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, like your novels, you embark and then there's a density at the same time as an openness. There's so many ideas in that work that you've just presented us with, and you've not avoided some of the calamitous possibilities that we face, but you've asked us to have hope as well.
Yeah.
So I think that is a wonderful start to the evening. I wanted to ask you, H.G. Wells, I was thinking about this idea of levelling up, and I've been wondering recently how you level up from a top-down position. He left school when he was 14, and he came from a very modest, well, poor background.
Indeed,
went to be a draper's assistant at 14. And so he is an example of somebody who sort of reached out for education, reached out for literature, and found within it the things that you've just been talking about, punching holes into a new world of understanding, awakening feelings that maybe he hadn't had, or giving recognition to the feelings he had. So how much of that idea of lived experience do you think is necessary? We have, as kind of only usually given the idea of intellectual permission to a certain class of people, and they have, traditionally been white men in the world, have been given the kind of the premier place. And yet people like H.G. Wells and many others coming from different lived experiences seem to be the voices that we now need to draw on.
Absolutely.
And so I'm interested to know whether you found that in him, that his background changed the way that you thought.
Definitely. And it has been, in a way, an eye-opening experience for me, because as you said, he does come from, completely disadvantaged background, and he's someone who not only finds knowledge important, but who's a polymath. He excels in so many disciplines, across disciplines. There are very few people like him. And we should not forget that he wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He didn't go to these very privileged schools. Today, now, fast forward, I find it problematic that we always see the term public intellectual, we take it as a sign of arrogance. Nobody would use it for themselves, and we wouldn't use it for other people unless we want to make fun of them. But I don't want to use it in that context. I want to use it for people who are exactly like Wells, for people who have done or who are trying to do what he has done, because knowledge is important. And I think he's right in that regard, this duality between education and catastrophe. I'm not saying education is the key that's going to solve everything, but there is a reason why. Let's look at the world. Wherever in the world there has been a rise in populism, populism is not only anti-pluralism, anti-women's rights, anti-feminism, it is also anti-knowledge. In Turkey, you will hear, people saying, and they say this openly, the real people, our real people are those who never go to school. They make it sound as if, if you love books, if you read books, then you are the pawn of Western powers. You're not a real native person. But it's not only happening in Turkey. From Brazil to, India, you can hear versions of this, different echoes of the same discourse. So there's an anti-intellectual trend within populism that I find very dangerous. And I really want to celebrate women public intellectuals. I really want to celebrate working class public intellectuals. We need to bring that diversity into our public spaces and stop the hegemony that comes, especially in this country, with class, with private school education. If you know how to recite poems in Latin, that gives you a privilege. It doesn't. We need a different vision, a different narrative. And all I'm trying to say is, who are the people who are not included to the table when decisions are being made? Where are the untold stories? Where are the forgotten voices? Where's the periphery? I think we need to bring the periphery to the center. We need to empower the disempowered and take care of these inequalities, which are getting worse and worse every day.
And it is interesting, isn't it, that when you have somebody like H.G. Wells who has sort of become embedded in our idea of, he's one of us, so that he becomes a public intellectual eventually when he's dead, really. It's always very helpful to be dead in terms of being accepted, if you've had any radical views. And and now we do have our own culture wars, and they're getting more extreme. So it isn't just in other countries that this idea that popularism equals get rid of education. I mean, the metropolitan elite phrase, all of these things suggests that ideas making and public discourse and progressive thought and challenging the norm, that somehow this is dangerous and not appropriate to family life or community celebration and so on. And I was very struck when Dan said, you're the most read novelist in this country, female novelist in this country, because I was thinking, God, and you're an immigrant. Wow.
I think he meant in Turkey. I think he meant in Turkey.
The whole idea of the contribution that you've made here, again, I think that now that you're famous and important, then you'll be embraced. But until that point comes, we're not a country that welcomes the idea of outsider voices. So, how do you think that we in this country are dealing with the idea of the public intellectual, if you like?
It's a bit tricky. I moved to the UK it's been more than 12 years now. When I first came here, but that was pre-Brexit, of course, I used to think British people are so calm when they talk politics, It's just amazing. And of course, I no longer think that way because that calmness has evaporated. And I've seen how Brexit saga, in a way, broke a system that was maybe strained, and it became, those martial metaphors that I was talking about. Politics did become more combative, more aggressive. I personally will never forget the day I saw the first page of a tabloid with pictures of judges and saying enemies of the people. I literally froze because I know that phrase, enemies of the people, being used elsewhere. So it's very dangerous. We might have disagreements, we might have our own debates. That doesn't mean we're each other's enemies, or let alone the enemies of the people. That was what the people who stormed the Capitol in the US on the 6th of January, that's what they wrote on the doors, media is the enemy of the people. So we need to be very careful about how we use these words. But basically, I guess what I'm trying to say, again, when you look at places where, unfortunately, populist authoritarianism has taken hold, there is a reason why populist demagogues love tension. They love polarization. They thrive upon that. And this is a huge challenge. How do we communicate with people who vote differently, speak differently, who have different views? I think we need to be very critical of all kinds of demagoguery, people who try to exploit, people's feelings, but at the same time, always connect with people coming from different backgrounds and with different views and try to see where do we agree, where do we overlap, where do we coexist. Because if we lose those democratic norms and institutions, then it's a much more dangerous habitat. So pluralism, diversity, inclusion, all of these matter. And for that, I think we need to talk. We need to be more engaged citizens. We need to be more involved. We no longer have the luxury of being apolitical. We no longer have the luxury of saying, I don't want to talk about politics. I'm not interested in politics. Politics is interested in all of us. But I'm not talking about party politics, and I'm definitely not talking about partisan politics. Really, it's not about that. I'm just talking about core issues, like rule of law, like separation of powers. We all need this. Whether you vote Tories or Labour or Greens or any other party, we all need these core fundamental democratic institutions.
Okay, so over to you, audience. You had the invitation from Elif to disagree with her or agree with her, or just, have a thought. If you could put the lights up a bit more, because I can't quite see the upper level. Yeah. Anybody like to ask a question? Is there somebody that, yes? Where's the microphone coming? Yeah, there's somebody here. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Oh, you got, okay, you start and then we'll come to you, okay? No, you go.
Right. Don't disagree with a lot of what you said. However, I never shared your optimism in the 1990s and the turn of the century about how things were getting better. Because the key question, which you have as yet not been explicit about, is that societies based on competition and profit inevitably end up in the way we are. So I think you don't disagree with what you say, but I don't think you're going far enough. Your optimism was false optimism, and the reality of what you're describing now is in fact the case, but it is linked to societies based on profit and competition. And as long as we have that motive, we will have these problems.
All right, thank you for that contribution. I'll let you come back on that in a second, and we'll take the next, yes.
Thanks. I have lived in this country for 48 years. And
48?
Yeah.
Amazing.
And what I would like to mention is this is a wonderful country, but, it really reveres practicality and pragmatism. And what works, works. And how do you make that shift from those values and those dimensions into public intellectualism? It's a fascinating journey, and I think we need to switch to intellectualism because it breeds a kind of civil community consciousness and breeds and feeds, and I think it would make us a much better nation.
Thank you.
Can I just ask, you've lived here 48 years, does that mean you are 48, or did you live somewhere else before?
No, I lived somewhere else before. I'm a bit older than 48, thank you.
That's right, there's a wonderful light shining on you. You look very useful. Yeah,
Thank you.
Too much optimism?
Yeah, thank you so much for both questions and the, the criticism and the comment. I'm not a very optimistic person, actually. I'm Turkish. I can't be very optimistic. It's not in my DNA, I sometimes think if you open a map of Europe and if you trace the river Danube, the blue Danube with your finger, as you move from Germany towards the Black Sea, the level of optimism drops. So by the time you reach Bulgaria, Romania, of course, Turkey, we're not very optimistic people. But of course, what I believe in actually is I think a healthy dose of pessimism and optimism is perhaps better. So I am critical of the extreme optimism of late 1990s and early 2000s because I think it created its own complacency, it created its own arrogance, and this idea that democracy is achieved here in the West, it's somewhere over there that people have to worry about the future of democracy.
Fukuyama, the end of history.
The end of history, no more, because liberal democracy has triumphed. That was an illusion. But too much pessimism can also be quite debilitating. So we have to find a combination. And there's this beautiful saying by Gramsci that I really like. He talks about the pessimism of the intellect. And I think it's okay for the mind to be pessimistic. Actually have a positive view on pessimism in that regard. But he also talks about the optimism of the heart, optimism of the will. And that's a brilliant combination. So let our minds be more pessimistic so that we can understand what's at stake. But let our hearts be more optimistic, more hopeful. This is what we need, what are we celebrating also in this festival. And that hope, that optimism comes from our fellow human beings. Because there is something that is stronger in the world which always fascinates me, whether you call it love or sisterhood or friendship or humanism, whatever that thing is, even in places of civil war, ethnic violence, that thing has survived. So let us not forget its existence either. So therefore, maybe a combination of pessimism and optimism. With regards to your beautiful question, I make a distinction between information, knowledge, and wisdom. I think we're living in an age in which we have way too much information, but very little knowledge and even less wisdom. So how do we change this ratio? Because information, the truth is, we just consume, and the next moment we don't even remember it. It's very speedy, we don't absorb it, we have no time to process it. Knowledge requires to slow down. You can't rush knowledge. So for knowledge, we need books, we need investigative journalism, in-depth analysis, but most importantly, to slow down, not to rush into judgments. And hopefully, eventually, we need wisdom. For that, we need emotional intelligence. We need empathy. We need to bring the mind and the heart together. So, you wanted to add something? And we need intellectual contemplation, absolutely. And maybe an inner garden. So on social media, we don't have time for any of this. I share also your positive comments about this country. I also, as a writer, as a woman, I found lots of freedoms in this country, which I will always appreciate. And I know this sounds like a cliche to many people, but to me it isn't. The fact that London is so diverse, the fact that Manchester is so diverse, is precious to me. I'm not taking it for granted, So it is important, because in life I think we don't learn anything from sameness. If all my friends think like me, speak like me, it means I'm surrounded by my mirror image. That's a very narcissistic existence. If we only hear the echoes of our voice, echoes don't tell us anything new. It is differences that teach us, something valuable in life. So these cosmopolitan encounters, which are belittled today, diversity, which is belittled today, multiculturalism, which was once a positive word. I remember Angela Merkel was using it, and then suddenly everyone discarded it. It matters to me. And when I hear politicians in this country saying, if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere, it really breaks my heart. I mean, why can't we be a citizen of Manchester, of this country, of this, continent? So local, national, regional, international, but also global, like concentric circles. We can have multiple belongings, and the truth is we do have multiple belongings. And I think we need to defend multiplicity in an age which doesn't allow us to be multiple.
Thank you, Elif. Can I just check whether there's anybody upstairs who has... Yeah?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
You've told us a little bit about what you think a good society looks like, and also what a damaged society looks like. And I was just wondering, the community in your novel, the Flea Palace, whether that's sort of your idea, damaged and complex as it is, of a good society or a good community.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I'll just see whether there's anybody else upstairs who's also got a question. Somebody there? Yeah.
Thank you for tonight. It's been a very excellent discussion and presentation. I'm really interested in Wales and the work you did in Africa, which resulted in the League of Nations, and it's a result of the work we're doing in Africa and Kenya at the moment to look at community. So I'm very interested in the science fiction, and whether if you were a character, which character would you be in any of his books?
Wow. what a fascinating question. I don't know. I'm very intrigued in the way he brought together, of course, an amazing fiction writer, but also an amazing thinker, and his ability to, I think if he were alive today, for instance, in my opinion, he would be also very interested in neuroscience, not only in science. So the way he draws on so many multiple disciplines, that kind of freedom, maybe I'm taking a slightly different path, is sometimes not given to authors from diverse backgrounds. There's a kind of identity politics in the publishing world that I don't like, that I'm very critical of, and I'll try to give you an example. For instance, if there's an Afghan woman writer, we don't expect her to write science fiction. We don't expect her to produce avant-garde experimental fiction. We want her to write books that take place in Afghanistan and focus on the lives of women in Afghanistan and the sad lives of women in Afghanistan. So there's an expectation. She might prefer to do that, but maybe the next novel is going to be about something completely different. You know what I mean? So that kind of freedom is, for me as an author, is incredibly important. I'm not directly answering your question, but that's what I find in H.G. Wells. The openness, the intellectually, he's a nomad, I can see. And I like that very much. So maybe rather than one particular character, it is that mobility of the mind, his cognitive flexibility, that very much inspires me.
And his work, his understanding, his interest, his dialogue with the African continent, in other words, his sense that we need to learn from the history of our worlds.
Yeah.
This is, again, not something that everybody has appreciated about him, because he's often classified as like terribly English, and English tends to be quite a small space.
Yeah. And also right now, because when we're having, and we are having the important discussions about memory, public statues, the way history is being taught at schools. What do we choose to remember and what do we choose to forget? I think they're incredibly important questions. So what we learn from each other is also important in that context. In my opinion, memory is a responsibility, not in order to get stuck in the past, but to learn from the past, but also to understand what are the voices and stories that are not included in the main narrative.
And your point about a good society was in relationship to your...
Yes, the Flea Palace, I really appreciate that. I didn't think of the Flea Palace in those terms. This is the story of an apartment building in Istanbul with completely different tenants and people living in different flats. I think, for me, Istanbul has always been a big passion, and it's such a complex city. In Turkey, of course, we have just following up also from what we said earlier, Turkey has a very long and rich history, no doubt, but that doesn't mean we have a strong memory. Just the opposite. I think we're a society of collective amnesia. And Istanbul, too, has urban amnesia. So you can walk by an old, dilapidated building, and you have no way of knowing who lived there, what happened to those families, where did they go, why is this building in ruins? There are no placards, no signs. And it's important to chase. In the Flea Palace, I think there was an attempt to understand this multi-layered complexity of Istanbul, both the beauties, but also the remnants, the ruins, the absences, the silences in the city. That was very crucial for me when I was writing it.
Other questions? Yes, there's people here, one here and one at the back. And there's another one at the top. Okay, I'll come back to you. Oh, you've got one already. Well, while this mic's coming here, would you like to take the question? Yep.
Oh, yeah, I don't mind. Thank you. Thanks very much. Just following on from your comments about Istanbul, and I guess as an immigrant who hasn't been in the country for 48 years, but a bit less than that, I've noticed that the relationship of the immigrant with their own kind of home origin country changes and becomes more complex as time goes on. Could you just maybe say a bit about your relationship with Turkey and is it like now, and has that changed over the years? How much of you remains Turkish? Thanks.
Let's take two other questions. Yeah? Yep.
Hi, Elif.
Hi.
I'll go to this one first, and then I'll come back to you. Okay.
I'm also from Istanbul. First 22 years of my life I lived there, and then the last 22 here in the UK, and I call myself British Turkish. But I share your views in terms of what is expected from someone from different ethnic background, because I'm an academic clinician, and I'm always asked about why I don't do more research about the rare diseases in Turkey, for example. So it's whether you're an author or scientist, there's expectations always the same.
True.
But recently, we have a bit of empty nest syndrome. Our daughter just went to university. We just dropped her off last week in Plymouth, and everybody started to call her Northern. So, and she said, everybody's asking, where are you from your accent? And of course, she's got a British accent, Northern accent.
Sure.
But I have, despite living here 20 years, always been asked every time I meet someone, where you really from?
Yeah, yeah.
And when I lived in Istanbul, and people say, where are you from? You say Istanbul. People say, but where are you really from? Because nobody is really from Istanbul,
True.
even though I was. So this question always fascinated me, and you talk about a lot in your novels about being nomad.
Yeah.
And not necessarily belonging. But what about this tribalism that we always need to know where people are from?
Yeah.
And with this COVID and travel restrictions, now people are less moving easily.
Yeah.
Where do you see us going from that?
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Okay, and I'll just take this last question at the back, yeah?
Hi, Elif. PEN's founder, Catherine Amy Dawson-Scott, spoke about scattering the seams of friendliness. What do you think are the small acts that we can do in our lives that make a difference?
Thank you. It's beautiful, beautiful questions. Also emotionally challenging questions. I mean, our relationship with our motherlands, how does it change over the years? Maybe I should start with that. They're connected. I believe in maybe portable homelands. You know, I think a lot about roots. In the latest novel, The Island of Missing Trees, maybe those of you who have read will remember, there's a fig tree at the heart of that story, but it also gave me a chance to think about roots. What does it mean to be uprooted, almost deracinated, and rerouted? I think when we think of roots, it doesn't have to be buried in the ground in a very claustrophobic, way. There's this beautiful story about the baobab tree in Africa. According to the legend, baobab trees were very curious, wandering trees, and they wanted to discover the world, so they were walking around all the time. And God got very annoyed. So he started to stop the trees and turn them upside down so that they wouldn't walk around anymore. And that's why they have these roots up in the air. But that imagery of having your roots not necessarily buried in one place, but up in the air, and getting sunshine and air and rain from multiple places. So having your roots open rather than just, static. I like that kind of imagery. When I look at myself, of course, I think of myself as an Istanbulite primarily, and I think anyone who reads my fiction can see that I love the city, and it keeps coming with me. We don't abandon the places we love just because we're miles away from them, just because we're continents away from them. We carry them with us. And therefore, when you're an immigrant, I think there's a certain melancholy to it. There's a certain sense of absence. As you can hear in my accent, I am an immigrant, also in this language. I write in English, but I can never forget the fact that I'm a latecomer, I'm a newcomer, that English for me is an acquired language. I did not grow up in a bilingual house or a multilingual house. And as an immigrant, you're always aware of the fact that the mind and the tongue are never coordinated. The mind runs faster, and your tongue tries to catch up and always fails to do so. So there's a gap, and that gap can be very frustrating. It can also be inspiring. But still, English gave me another sense of, freedom, a zone of existence. So there's a melancholy, there's a sense of absence when you leave something behind, and that keeps coming with you. I am very attached to Istanbul. I think I'm also very attached to the Balkans. I am attached to the Turkish culture, particularly oral culture, women's culture. When I think about the people, I feel very emotional. When I think of politics in Turkey and politicians, I feel very depressed. So there are two sides to it. Also, there are elements in my soul from the Middle East. I am a European, person by the values that I share. I have become a Londoner, I have become a British citizen, and as I said earlier, I would like to think of myself as a citizen of humanity. So on the one hand, these multiple belongings help, but on the other hand, there is a melancholy that you will never, ever discard. That too will keep coming with you. And it's a very, very emotional attachment. It's a very complex thing. But I think, coming back to what you said, with our accents, with our gaps, absences, or melancholy, I think we should always fight for multiplicity. And we should be able to say, yes, I am from here, but I'm also from there. And by the way, sometimes people say, well, you can't do that if you have the privilege of traveling, as if it's only some people that have multitudes. I think we all have multitudes, like Walt Whitman said. So you might be born and raised in the same village, in the same town, but whether it's your sexual identity, the stories of your ancestors, your political affiliations, anything and everything, every human being is so complex. So it doesn't matter whether you were born in the same, born and raised in the same town or traveled, we all have multiplicities. The problem is we're not allowed to celebrate it in this age, so I think it's worth fighting for that. With regards to small acts, I really love that question because it is those small acts that make such a huge difference, and we never forget them. I also think stories are like those small acts. There are interesting studies that show if we go to a talk, if the talk is given mostly through facts, analysis, statistics, graphics, the next day, when we wake up, we have already forgotten around 56% of it. And then the next day, even more. But if the same talk is given through stories, personal stories, through feelings, through emotions, then we remember. We remember for much, much longer. So I think as human beings, we communicate in stories, we think in stories, we feel in stories, and what we remember in stories. That's why, whether it's small acts of kindness or stories, these are the things that really make a difference. And if I may add this very quickly, this is the right time to discover this, because if the pandemic has taught us anything, well, it has taught us many things, but primarily that we should rethink. This is a moment of reckoning. It's a moment of rethinking, what are my priorities? What are our values? Individually and collectively. Is it to make more money, more profit, more corporate greed, or is it those immaterial things in life, like friendship, like love, like sisterhood, like our very connection with the environment, that really, really is the most important thing and hopefully will be the long-lasting thing. So it's a moment in which we have to reorganize our own values and priorities, and that should be a good time to think about those small acts of sharing and compassion and kindness.
So, this was a beautiful evening. I think we'll agree. And without really facts, you've taught us so much. I think this is an evening of wisdom. And you've said so much, but somehow you slowed down time. That's quite an achievement. We have to stop because at 8:30, Simon Armitage is introducing the first of the 10 declarations of poetic rights. And I hope you're coming to that as well. It's quite an emotional evening, this, for lots of reasons. Because you've attended to our melancholy and you've also attended to our right to joy. I was just thinking about Maria Bota here, who worked on the festival with me, and Dan. We were saying tonight that we've been talking about doing this event for so long, and this is actually the first public event that many of the artists have ever done in the last 2 years. So it's a sort of, my God, there's real people, here we are, and we can touch each other, just about. And so it is a joy to come back together again, but it's also very interesting at this point that COVID has sort of made us use technology in many positive ways, because the festival is a sort of hybrid of people who are going to join us from other parts of the world, people who are joining us from other parts of the country because they want to carry on shielding, and people who are in Manchester and don't want to yet be in a public situation. Sure. But you came in the flesh today, and it's very, very appreciated that you did that. It's been a wonderful lecture, and I hope that people will celebrate PEN along with the Festival Ripples of Hope, and that you'll take Dan's invitation to find out more about PEN. Join PEN. Don't underestimate the acts of being able to attend to somebody else who is separate, lonely, isolated, in danger. You know, if we've got some agency of any kind, and you wouldn't be here tonight if you didn't have some, then, you know, let's use it. Let's use it very positively. And let's fight for the plurality that Elif's talked about, and also for the kind of idea that we need to carry on being as curious as possible, especially about the things that we think we've already decided we don't like. Thank you so much for tonight. It's been fantastic. Elif Shafak.
Thank you so much.